I'm just going to wait a few more moments to allow people to join. Okay, well, I'm going to start now and people can join as we carry on. So, hello and welcome to the first event of Trinity Term for the Oxford Forum for Questioning Extremism. How much longer will America be a democracy? It has been almost 2 years since Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump in the 2020 presidential elections. In response to his loss, Trump began to make unsubstantiated allegations of election fraud, which culminated in the storming of the Capitol by Trump supporters, who tried to overturn his defeat by disrupting the joint session of Congress, who had assembled to count the electoral votes needed to formalize Biden's victory. As America and the rest of the world looked on at these shocking scenes on the 6th of January 2021, many reflected on the way in which the US had gone from being a bastion of democracy to reflecting the global rise of nationalism and authoritarianism, leading some to ask, how much longer will America be a democracy? Today, we aim to cover an overview of the impact of Trump's legacy and the threat of Trumpism on US democracy, as well as anti-democratic legislation and how democracy can be protected. Our discussion will last around 40 minutes, which leaves about 15 minutes at the end for your questions from the audience. In this final segment, I will be able to unmute you, and you can ask your questions directly to our panelist by pressing the raise hand feature. It is now my pleasure to introduce our panel. Professor Larry Bartels is the co-director of the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions and the May Worthen Shayne Chair in Public Policy and Social Science at Vanderbilt University. He's the author of several books, including Democracy for Realists, Why Elections Do Not Produce a Responsive Government, and Unequal Democracy, The Political Economy of the New Gilded Age. Professor Nolan McCarty is the director of the Center for Data-Driven Social Science at Princeton University, where he is also the Susan Dodd Brown Professor of Politics and Public Affairs. He is the author of the book, Polarization, What Everyone Needs to Know, and Political Bubbles, Financial Crises and the Failure of American Democracy, and the founder of the Quarterly Journal of Political Science. And finally, we have Anthony Zurcher, who has been covering both US politics and culture to an American and international audience for the last 13 years, and is currently the BBC's Senior North American Correspondent. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I would like to begin by offering each panelist a few moments to explain their work in more detail. So, Professor Bartels.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. I've worked mostly on American politics in the last several years. I've also done some research on comparative politics. I've just finished a book on contemporary politics in Europe and the so-called crisis of democracy in Europe. I've also looked at the structure of the Republican Party and some of the attitudes of Republican voters in particular. I would say I'm representative of the field of American politics in the sense of having not paid much attention to the kinds of questions that we're going to talk about today for most of my career. Most scholars of American politics thought that we were beyond worrying about violence and political breakdowns, democratic breakdowns. And so over the last several years, as American politics has changed, we've been scrambling to keep up. One of the most striking things to me is how hard it is to talk about these issues, given how little we know about democracy and how little consensus there is about the theory of democracy. And so often when people worry about democratic erosion, it requires a lot of real effort to think about what it is that they're actually talking about and what the normative standards are that they're implicitly bringing to bear in criticizing the political reality in a particular country at any particular time. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Professor McCarty?
Great. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be online here. Most of my work over the past 20, 25 years is focused on the polarization of US politics, the emergence and deepening of partisan divisions across a wide variety of issues. Somewhat like Professor Bartels, I was doing most of the work within the context of kind of a stable democratic system in which, there could be deepening partisan differences and disagreements, and they would translate into policymaking failures or inaction or gridlock, but within the context of a kind of a continuing democratic process. And so like he is, we are now going through the kind of like, how to fit what I was doing before, what it is that I could have seen in the earlier research about polarization that leads to some precursors of what happened, on January 6th. So I hope to be able to share, some of my kind of preliminary thoughts about how the long history of political polarization in the United States is a precursor, but also kind of, suggests some different perspectives on, what we might expect for the future.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And Anthony?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. As you mentioned, I've been covering American politics, at least with the BBC, since 2013, 2014. I very early on started covering the presidential campaign for 2016. That included a wide range of candidates on the Republican side, including Donald Trump, who I don't think a lot of people really took all that seriously in the beginning, but was able to get kind of a front row seat watching his rise, essentially hostile takeover of the Republican Party. I was going to Trump rallies from middle of late 2015 and could to pretty much all of the Republican debates leading up to that general election in 2016. And you could really see the chaos he was creating, the lack of any kind of organized response among the Republican establishment to the threat that he presented to them, and then eventually the ability he had to not only win the election with his kind of insurgent campaign, but over the course of 4 years of his presidency, mold the Republican Party from the grassroots up into one that reflected his worldview and was full of his supporters. I covered the Trump White House for the BBC at the White House and also on the road with the president off and on over the course of 4 years. Obviously, it was a very tumultuous time to be covering American politics, and unlike my academic colleagues who had able to get a little more perspective, I was kind of right up close trying to cover the day-to-day changes in the news based on what he would tweet or what he would say or who he would fire. So it's nice to step back and get a little perspective on all of this now that Trump has left office, although I think we'll all agree that the political forces that led to Trump and that he unleashed are still having an effect on American politics.
Great, well, thank you so much. I want to start off with quite a broad question, which is, to what extent has the legacy of the big lie, the false claim that Donald Trump actually defeated Biden in the 2020 election, and the insurrection damaged democracy in the US? And perhaps Professor Bartels would like to go first.
Yeah, I guess I think of the big lie not so much as the heart of the issue, but as kind of a symptom or a manifestation of the deeper issues in American politics right now. And I think it's helpful to think about them at three different levels. One is the level of professional politicians. The second is the level of activists, the kind of people who were actually involved in storming the Capitol, for example. And the third is the level of ordinary citizens. I think for ordinary citizens, the heart of the problem really is the degree of social change in the US over the last half century, and especially the shadow, the threatening shadow for many people of demographic change and the prospect of a majority-minority country, which so many people view as threatening to their deepest cultural values. For the political activists, it's that concern on steroids. And for the professional politicians, I think it's a combination of strongly held concerns about the status of democracy in America, but also a more opportunistic kind of simple desire and willingness to use what's out there for their own political benefit. If you think about the breakdown of democracy across the world, it almost always has to do fundamentally with the behavior of political elites rather than ordinary citizens. And citizens are strikingly willing to go along with whatever political leaders are doing, as long as it seems to be in their interests. And so, as Anthony mentioned, the willingness of ordinary Republicans first to support Trump's candidacy in 2016, and then to adopt many of the attitudes and claims that he's propounded over the subsequent years, I think is a really telling indication of the malleability of public opinion. But it's the willingness of political elites to exploit those tensions and that malleability that I think is the real heart of the problem here and the threat.
Thank you. Professor McCarty, would you like to add anything, or Anthony?
Sure. I will agree that, that what happened on January 6th is more of a symptom than an additional cause. It comes after kind of a long period of, deepening partisan animosity and distrust, much of it fueled by the types of demographic and social change that Professor Bartels mentioned. And so in that context, there's kind of this deep animosity of voters across the parties, which elites are able to kind of exploit. I think what people didn't anticipate is that the President of the United States would go so far in personally trying to exploit that type of a situation. But given that the kindling was there for the fire, some irresponsible actions among our leaders, certainly set it ablaze. But the conditions for what happened have been a fairly long time in coming.
Yeah, I think you both make good points. There have always been people unhappy in a close election. I mean, if you go back to 2000, there were people who talked about butterfly ballots and fraud in Florida. In 2004, Diebold voting machines were being rigged in Ohio, according to some on the left. I mean, 2016, you had Democrats at the grassroots and among the Green Party complaining about what they saw as Russian meddling and maybe even hacking of the election. But as Professor McCarty points out, the difference this time around was, whereas the leaders in the past still conceded, still accepted defeat, tried to bring the country together and move on. You can think of John McCain's concession speech, which was gracious in 2012, for instance. Donald Trump stoked those fires that picked up all of the conspiracy theories and elevated them. And Donald Trump, and any leader, but Donald Trump in particular, has a gift for being able to push issues to the forefront among his supporters and in his party. You saw him do it with immigration and a border wall, which, while immigration was an issue that the grassroots was concerned about, the idea of building a border wall was not nearly as prominent. He turned the Republican Party around on the issue of trade, where they had been very free trade in the past. Now they were much more protectionist. And he's made voter fraud, allegations of voter fraud and a stolen election a top issue for Republicans, to the point where I was at the CPAC conference in Florida, Republican grassroots gathering, and they did a poll of the attendees, and they put election security as the top issue they were concerned about. So he really is the driving force behind this, and he's the one that has led to voting rule changes in a lot of Republican-controlled states, and also candidates who are running for Secretary of State positions and election oversight positions in a lot of states who are going to be loyal to Donald Trump and who also accept the idea, the unfounded idea, I should say, that the 2020 election was stolen by Joe Biden and the Democrats.
Thank you. Professor McCarthy, often the media presents protecting democracy as the sole responsibility of Biden and the Democrats. Is it possible to make effective change without bipartisanship? And is this collaboration even possible, given the extreme partisanship of the two parties at the moment?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I want to be emphatic in thinking that it's not the sole responsibility of the Democratic Party. I don't really think that in this current environment that a single party can protect democracy against the entirety of another party simply because you need some people, you need wide consensus to accept democratic norms and institutions. And if it's done on a partisan basis within a divided country, I just don't think it'll be very successful. So one of the things that I found a little bit concerning, in the aftermath is that much of the response from the Democrats and the left in terms of reform is focused on a set of issues that Democrats have long touted: restrictions on corporate campaign finance, eliminating gerrymandering, having some more federal supervision of elections to prevent voter ID or intimidation. I think all of those things are kind of important. I support all of them, at least in principle. But they don't get to the kind of central issue of how you build a broad-based pro-democracy coalition that reaches across partisan boundaries and can, set a, as Professor Bartels mentioned, what is the underlying theory of democracy? How can we get it to be broadly acceptable to all parties? And so I think some of the response has been that everything has been attempted on a fairly partisan basis, not a whole lot of effort to try to build, a coalition, which will necessitate each side, both kind of pro-democracy Republicans, kind of putting aside some of their substantive policy goals, and progressives putting aside some of their substantive policy goals for the purposes of building kind of an electoral coalition that can support democracy. So I don't think we see that. We don't think we see that happening yet. In large part, it's just the structure of our party system and the deep partisanship that precludes it. But I think to have any success, there'll have to be some efforts to kind of build bridges across the parties in favor of a democracy agenda that goes beyond the kind of longstanding concerns that each party has about how to conduct elections or do campaign finance.
Thank you. I had a follow-up question for Anthony, which is any attempt by Biden to create bipartisan cooperation in the wake of the January 6th insurrection, helping to heal extreme polarization? Or does it create more divides between more moderate and extremist politicians within the parties?
Well, I think he talked a lot about bipartisan cooperation and healing in his inaugural address, and even on the campaign trail and after he was elected president. But it just has been a real challenge for him to be able to heal over the very real divisions in this country. I mean, if you look at his agenda early on, it wasn't super progressive. It wasn't super controversial. I mean, he focused on infrastructure spending. He focused on COVID, just distributing a lot of money. Some of the things he got in that COVID package were progressive priorities, such as child support payments that could be payable in monthly checks. And I think that was something Democrats want. But he didn't, for instance, follow Barack Obama's course of action, which was to try to reform healthcare very early on. He went much more small bore, and even his bigger package that he's tried to get through, which does have some progressive priorities, particularly on the environment and on healthcare, that's still not as sweeping as you would think. And he has been met, tooth and claw, for the most part, by political resistance among the right. So, I think that the divisions in this country run so deep that it is very difficult for anyone to govern, particularly someone to govern with small political majorities in Congress like Biden has.
Thank you. Professor Bartels, a NPR and Ipsos poll from earlier this year found that American voters that align themselves with right-wing politics are more likely to feel that US democracy is in crisis and at risk of failing. Why is it then the case that authoritarian leaning politicians are garnering more support in the Republican Party?
I guess the first thing I would say is that you should take with a big grain of salt what ordinary people say in surveys about abstract questions about democracy. It's often very hard to tell what they have in mind. If you look at cross-national surveys, one of my favorite results is there are these big cross-national surveys that ask people about how important democracy is and how satisfied they are with the workings of democracy in their country. And even before Trump came on the scene, Americans were virtually indistinguishable from Chinese in terms of both their enthusiasm for democracy in the abstract and their assessment of how democratically their own country was being governed. And so they clearly have a very different notion of democracy than we do. And often when people respond to these questions, it's very hard to know what it is that they're talking about. But I think what that particular question taps is this deep concern on the right about the direction of American politics and the possibility that the populist aspects of democracy are leading the country off the rails by basically lodging political power in this class of people who they view as basically illegitimate and in one way or another not real citizens, sometimes literally and sometimes figuratively or symbolically. But when you say they're being led by authoritarian political figures, I think that's certainly true from one democratic perspective, but there's nothing that Trump did as president that was literally illegal. What he was doing was pushing the norms and the unwritten conventions of democracy in ways that they hadn't been pushed before. And I think one of the more interesting political developments, not just of Trump's presidency, but of the last 20 or 30 years, is that we've come to discover how many of the norms that we thought were binding on constraints on the behavior of political actors turn out not to be that important. Not only Trump, but George W. Bush, for example, violated a variety of norms that people had viewed as being constraining on a president's behavior and turned out not to be. And so given that record, they looked around for some more norms to violate. And of course, Trump is such a non-politician, or at least an unconventional politician, that he often doesn't even know what the norms are. But if he is made aware of them, he's happy to violate them nonetheless.
Did you want to add something, Professor McCarthy?
Yes, I've had on the question, I just have a quick thought, which may help rationalize it, may be slightly optimistic, but it is notable that people promoting Stop the Steal made their argument that Trump should still be in power based on a stolen election rather than an authoritarian approach to politics. They weren't going around saying that we need to install this strong leader because he's a strong leader. They said that we need to install him because he was the legitimate, in their view, the legitimate winner. So it is probably true that these voters who say they're concerned about democracy think they're concerned about democracy in a particular way. And they think that Democrats' norms were violated by the outside, which suggests that we're a long way. Hopefully, we're a long way away from people justifying authoritarian politics on purely authoritarian grounds. it's still at least being couched in terms of kind of a perverted lust for democracy.
Wonderful. This is another question for Professor McCarty, which is it possible for politicians to get people to the polls from demographics with traditionally lower voter turnout, so young people, racial minorities, and rural communities, without resorting to extreme or radical politics?
I mean, that is, that is a great question. It's a kind of a central debate about, how the left should proceed in this environment as to whether or not they should engage in more progressive oriented politics in order to get higher turnout, or whether or not they should, focus on issues that are more popular so that those people who are voting will vote. I suspect that most of the people who are not voting are not necessarily the ones who are going to be motivated by, as you said, radical politics. That notion, the underlying notion there is that there's a set of voters who are fairly well informed about politics and know that, at least for them, the Democratic Party alternative is not radical enough, and therefore choose not to vote because it's not radical enough. A couple of problems, I think, with that argument. One is that any voter who would know that the Democratic Party is not radical enough for it would know the consequences of electing a Republican Party that's pretty radical in the other direction. And the second is just the empirical one, which is it turns out that most non-voters are not particularly informed or engaged about politics. And so simply running more radical slogans, more hyper-progressive campaigns, I think is unlikely to make a dent in that population that has chosen not to participate in politics.
I will say there are things you could do to make it easier for young people to vote, and that they did during the COVID pandemic. Drive-through mailbox drops, mail ballots, that sort of thing, that have been shown to drive up turnout across the board, including among younger voters. And it's telling, I think, that one of the big pushes from Republican legislators after Donald Trump's contesting the election was to roll back all of those changes, to do away with mail ballots, to do away with drop boxes, to make it harder to vote remotely. And there's clearly a political strategic component to that, because we haven't seen evidence that any of these things have the kind of problems with fraud that Donald Trump and Republicans have been alleging.
If I can just jump in on this, I think turnout is an issue that's kind of a warm and fuzzy issue for people on the left, because it's easy to say that the problems of democracy would be cured if only we could make it possible for everyone to turn out. But if you pursue that logic, I don't think it actually works very well. I mean, I would favor measures to increase turnout. I think the low level of turnout in American elections is an embarrassment. But on the other hand, one of the least discussed striking aspects of the 2020 election was that turnout was hugely up. There were millions of people who hadn't been sufficiently motivated to participate before, who came out of the woodwork, and millions of them voted for Donald Trump. So the idea that if only we could, improve turnout at the margin and all the ills of democracy would thereby be cured, I think is a kind of fantasy connected with what Chris Aiken and I called the folk theory of democracy in our book.
The same thing happened in the Virginia gubernatorial election in 2021. Turnout was great among Democrats. So, all things considered, turnout was better, more motivated among Republicans. So, it's as Professor Bartels mentions, it is not necessarily a boon for the Democrats.
Yeah, parties are very bad at predicting what reforms to election rules will do for their benefits. They, in fact, there's some evidence now that voter ID has benefited Democrats because it mobilized so many Democratic voters that it swamped any effects it might have on, keeping people out of the ballot box. So the party, I mean, Anthony's right. People argue a lot. There's a lot of partisan intensity on these issues, but both sides are not particularly good at predicting the consequences of these changes.
Right. Well, due to the recent news regarding the Supreme Court and Roe versus Wade, Anthony is unfortunately going to have to leave early to be with the BBC. So I'm just going to ask him one final question before he goes. And that is, has social media, general distrust and polarization made journalism less effective in fighting for the future of democracy?
I think social media has definitely helped silo people much more than they were prior to Facebook and Twitter. It used to be that, at least in America, a lot of people would get all their news from the same source. They'd watch the evening news on one of the three networks, and subscribe to their local newspaper, which back then would be a more robust news gathering organization than a lot of local newspapers are now, or they'd read the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. So I think it's much easier now because of social media to get kind of in an echo chamber of people who agree with you politically, and that directs you to websites, to news sources that feed you information that you agree with politically, or feed you information that prompts your outrage, but it directs your outrage towards certain groups. So I think there are benefits to social media, and I think that things like Twitter, which I use pretty regularly, are a great way to reach new audiences. And if you use it properly, it can expose you to a range of views that can challenge your assumptions, and from people who are incredibly bright and incredibly thoughtful, but don't share your same political views. Unfortunately, I don't think that's the way most people use it. So you look at Facebook as a phenomenon. I think, particularly in 2016 and onward, Facebook has been, a kind of a toxic political effect on voters. I was in Alaska last year covering the Alaskan legislature, and Lisa Murkowski, who is going to be in a contested race for re-election as a moderate Republican senator this year. And the one thing I heard from political watchers there, time and time again, was that Alaska used to work. It has the last bipartisan legislatures. That is a legislature run by a bipartisan coalition. Republicans and Democrats there used to work across the aisle, and still do sometimes, to solve Alaska problems on a local level. But I heard complaints from Republican politicians who were getting primaried out of office, and from voters across the political spectrum, that Fox News and Facebook and kind of these national political winds that used to leave Alaska alone now are really shaping politics even up there, and it's making it more extreme. It's making it more polarized, to the point where you can't be someone like Lisa Murkowski, who delivers her constituents but takes a kind of a moderate view on other issues, without getting very real blowback from certain segments of your constituency, and in particular, the kind of people who get motivated to vote in political primaries, where it's a lot smaller of an electorate, but a lot more passionate and kind of polarized to one base or the other. And again, thanks for having me on. I've really enjoyed this discussion.
Thank you so much for joining us.
I can just jump in on this point. I did a series of surveys during the Trump presidency trying to get at ordinary people's attitudes and differences in attitudes between Republicans and Democrats, and asked about a variety of social groups to see how the feelings toward these groups were polarized by partisanship. And there were some, very polarized groups like Muslims and Black Lives Matter, where the views of Democrats and Republicans were very different. And then there were the even more polarized groups, journalists and college professors. And so I think it's really important that both of those groups that are supposed to be, among the referees in the political fight are widely viewed as being in the midst of the fight themselves at this point, especially by people on the right. And of course, Trump's presidency just exacerbated that problem. If you're a journalist and the president is telling 20,000 lies, or whatever the final count turned out to be, it's impossible not to point that out. But by pointing it out, and in some cases harping on it, you're simply entrenching the views of Trump supporters that the press is rigged against him, and that in some sense the political establishment is rigged against him and therefore against them. I don't know what the solution to that problem is, but I think it's really an important and difficult one.
Yeah, I just mentioned a couple of additional issues with social media. One is Professor Bartels mentioned that we can have this, just think of this distinction between elite politics and popular politics. One of the problems with Twitter especially is that it's elite politics that thinks it's mass politics. And therefore, that people think that Twitter popular equals real popular. And so I think that Twitter has often been kind of a source of kind of bad political ideas on the right and the left, because they resonate with a fairly polarized set of highly educated elite actors, and then they don't translate very well into like the aspirations and lives of voters. And so I think that's been an important distortion of our politics. The other distortion, I think, is the way in which our leaders use Twitter to bring attention to themselves and to raise money. I mean, if you look at many of the members of Congress, especially on the right, but not exclusively on the right, they view their job as to go on social media, make provocative statements, raise money to get reelected so that they can go back on social media in the next term and raise more money. So, I mean, in some ways, it's good to have a direct conduit between elected officials and voters that's unmediated by the media, but it takes a certain amount of, one has to be careful about how one takes that. It really has been kind of a distortion to our politics to make it where the most extreme voices can be amplified and therefore funded and then re-amplified.
Okay, I'm going to sign off now. Thanks again so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Right. Okay, Professor McCarty, why is it that so-called culture wars are now dominating headlines, but also political discourse more than traditional political policies?
Well, I mean, I have a couple of thoughts about that. I mean, part of it, I think, is that the culture wars are the sorts of things that makes it fairly easy to mobilize certain types of voters. Much more than kind of real debates about what the minimum wage should be, or how high the estate tax should be, and so it's something that draws a lot of attention. I also think there's a media aspect to it, which is that these are issues that are somewhat easier for the media to cover. It's much easier to cover, the Don't Say Gay bills in Florida and their implications than it is, the impact of the child tax credit on labor supply and therefore inflation and economic growth. It's just something that's very hard to get voters to engage with. I think a lot of the divisions among members of Congress at the level in which they're doing it really are about these issues, but that's an elite politics and interest group driven politics, an ideological politics about the role of the government. But what gets used in elections are kind of more simple, visceral issues. That appeal and motivate voters, and that the reporters are more willing to cover in detail.
If I can just add to that, I think there's an institutional issue here that Nolan has written about a lot in his work, which is that as the parties become more polarized, it's harder for them to get anything done. And so if legislation, or at least major legislation, is really off the table, there's very little political cost in spending your time talking about things that are talking issues rather than actual legislative issues. But I think the deeper issue here is just that so many people feel that their deepest values are threatened by the current state of American politics. For people on the right, they feel threatened by social change, as we've already talked about. For people on the left, they feel like the path of justice that they see America having followed over the last half century is now endangered by the reaction on the other side. And so there's a kind of clash, not only of deeply held values, but of moralistic attitudes on both sides that tends to feed the flames.
Wonderful. So I suppose we probably only have time for one more question. Perhaps both of you would like to weigh in on before we open up for questions from the audience. And that is whether traditional mechanisms such as impeachments and investigatory committees can still adequately protect American democracy.
Yeah, I think that those things are going to be constrained by partisanship, as we've seen with the January 6th committee. I think it's very impossible to have kind of a committee investigate, electoral malfeasance that's not going to be politicized either by the ones who are running it or by those who've chosen not to participate in it. I think there's also, Larry talked about norms that have been breached over the years. One norm that's not being breached fast enough is the notion of bringing criminal charges against political figures who are viable candidates for high office. I think things have been a little bit slow, even in the criminal investigation front, on some of these issues, out of a sense of wanting to kind of protect longer term norms. So I think really the way forward, to sort of protect democracy is to think about institutional ways of engineering possible coalitions that cut across parties with respect to these issues. And one of the ideas that have been, in circulation is, at least for lower houses of Congress and lower house state legislatures, move to more multi-member districts or to some forms of proportional representation, which will factionalize existing parties or create other spaces for other parties, just so that you have that flexibility to actually, push forward a pro-democracy agenda or to investigate malfeasance. In the purely strict, very polarized two-party system, those things are not likely to be very successful.
As scholars of American politics have scrambled to catch up with the understanding in the rest of the world about political institutions and political processes, I think one of the things that we've been reminded of is some of the institutional weaknesses of the American system. One that came to mind when we were talking about the rise of Donald Trump is the extreme democratization of the presidential selection process in the US, which made Trump possible as a major party nominee in a way that he probably would not have been in almost any other country in the world. But another is the whole structure of separation of powers, which I think has a very difficult time dealing with extreme partisan polarization. And so often we find that the obvious solutions to problems within the American constitutional structure are really off the table unless you can manage to construct the kinds of cross-party coalitions that Nolan is talking about. And I think mostly that has to happen with baby steps and a lot of modesty on both sides. So the Democratic efforts to try to reform election laws, a case in point, rather than negotiate with moderate Republicans about things that could actually get done, they've mostly spent their time grandstanding about what they would like to have as their ideal in terms of political reform. And as a result, all of the vulnerabilities that we saw in 2020 are in place and in some cases have gotten worse.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So we're going to open the floor for questions from the audience. If you raise your hand, I will be able to unmute you and you can ask your question to our panelists, or alternatively, you can type your question into the Q&A chat box. So we have one question from the Q&A chat box, which says, do you think moving beyond the two-party system in America would rejuvenate American democracy or just speed up its deterioration? So they're thinking in particular about Annalena Baerbock's popularity with the Green Party in the recent German federal elections.
That's my comment about having more multi-member districts or more proportionality suggests. I think it would actually be a boon. I actually don't know whether it'd be more parties rather than just identifiable factions of the major parties. One of the things that's been true about these trends toward polarization I've talked about, not simply that the parties have moved farther apart in terms of their preferences and their goals, but that they've become somewhat less factionalized in the sense that they can't operate as distinct factions. There used to be conservative Democrats and liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans and moderate Republicans, even liberal Republicans. Some efforts to kind of at least rejuvenate that type of factionalism so that, cross-party coalitions can once again assert themselves when necessary, I think would be quite helpful to democracy. I would be a little skeptical that, having, standalone, because we still have a Senate that are single member districts, we have a presidency that can only be held by one person at one time, that we can ever get too far away from a two-party system. But those parties need to be much more flexible coalitions, much more factionalized coalitions, in order to, maintain accountability in events like we saw on January 6th.
Nolan said earlier that political scientists have not been very good at assessing the likely implications of election reforms. And I think that's true of political reforms more generally. It's often, it's possible to make a good logical case for a particular reform, but then once you embed that change in a complicated system with lots of other institutional features that it interacts with, you might get very different results than you expect. And I guess I agree that a real multi-party system within the US institutional structure would not be very feasible and probably would create as many problems as it would solve.
Thank you. And we've had another question from Roger Cotterell. Does the apparent intensification of partisanship in the Supreme Court merely reflect existing polarization in the US democracy or also intensify it?
I think it's a reflection in a variety of ways. I like to comment that basically, our elections in the US have been reduced to elections to see who gets to appoint the next Supreme Court justice, and that, that's how policy is made, and that's not very conducive to kind of a healthy democracy, to be not simply relying on courts, but have, these elections turn into battles about who gets to make appointments. I would make one, small observation about the notion of a partisan Supreme Court. The idea that the Supreme Court is actually partisan instead of ideological is going to be put to the test now. With the potential repeal of Roe versus Wade, is probably not something that most elected Republican politicians actually wanted, because, as Professor Bartels said earlier, one of the things that kind of accentuates the culture wars is that you can take symbolic stands on things that have no consequences. Now, I think in a variety of states, Republicans will now no longer be able to take these symbolic stands with zero consequences. And we'll see. I'm not very good at predicting things, but I think a partisan Supreme Court might have done things to protect the Republican Party more than it did. But just tossing Roe v. Wade out, 6 months before a general election is probably not what a partisan court would do, but certainly one that a court dominated by conservative ideologues would do.
I think the court is mostly a reflection of what's going on in the broader political system. If you look back through American history, there have been previous periods in which the court has become quite politicized, and it's often because they've gotten wrapped up in ideology and partisan political issues. I think the independent impact of the court on ordinary citizens' views about the political system are probably pretty modest. I think that's the kind of concern that's more likely to appeal to readers of the New York Times than to readers of USA Today. But it certainly is another manifestation of this broader process that we've been talking about.
Thank you. Eliza, I'm going to unmute you so that you can ask your question now.
Hi, am I audible? Yeah, okay, cool. Thank you for the great conversation. It's been really interesting to hear so far. My kind of double question is, so at one point, Professor Bartels, you mentioned how the political elite and journalists are looked at in a negative manner. Do you know what the people you surveyed thought about kind of the involvement of corporations and lobbyists in politics? And as a follow-up question to that, to either speaker, what do you think of the paper by actually Professor McCarthy's colleagues at Princeton, which states that the US is an oligarchy, not a democracy, due to this involvement of corporations and the ultra-rich? Sorry, that was quite a long question, but hopefully it was understandable.
Lobbyists are looked down on and despised by virtually everyone, so that's not a partisan political issue very much. Corporations are attacked more on the left and supported more on the right, although one of the implications of the kind of populist shift in the Republican Party is that they've been less solicitous of corporations than they used to be. I'm a big believer in the idea that money has an undue influence in American politics. One of the things that I had in mind when I talked at the very beginning about different views about democracy stems from that impression. At least one important strand of democratic theory suggests that your country is a democracy if ordinary citizens' views are taken into account more or less equally in the policymaking process. By that standard, the US is far from being a democracy. When that first was pointed out, there were lots of specific explanations about the failure of US institutions or US political culture that led to this unhappy state. But in the meantime, over the last several years, scholars around the world have employed similar methods to study the policymaking process in lots of other putatively democratic countries like Germany and Norway and the Netherlands and Switzerland. And they keep finding the same pattern in all these places, that political influence seems to be hugely disparate and connected to economic positions. And so by that standard, not only in the US, but in lots of other advanced democracies, the idea that we're really a democratic political system is probably a kind of happy fantasy more than it is a reality.
Just on the role of corporations in politics, I'm also inclined to agree that money in politics is a major issue. But one of the things that's become quite striking in recent years, as Professor Bartels mentioned, is the kind of the anti-corporate right, which is in some sense a response to progressive positioning of corporations in terms of their public relations and public imaging, which has mixed things up a little bit in terms of partisan politics. So currently we have an interesting partisan divide, which says corporations should donate less money. The left thinks corporations should donate less money to politics, but use every other form of their economic power to the fullest extent possible to promote, progressive social causes, including boycott states that pass this sorts of law or that sorts of law. You know, it's not surprising. I don't think that there's not more of a principled stand on what corporations should and shouldn't do with respect to American politics. I mean, both sides would like to leverage corporations to promote the things they want to have promoted. But, you know, this sort of clear partisan division of a pro-corporate Republican Party and an anti-corporate Democrat Party has really gotten, you know, muddled over the last 10 years.
Wonderful. And I think we've got time for one last question, which is from Elijah. We're seeing a push for the abolition of the filibuster to prevent minority parties blocking Senate advance. Is it more problematic for the filibuster to remain, giving disproportionate power, or to be removed, giving a majority party more power, especially in a time of such partisanship?
One thing that's important to recognize about the filibuster is one of the reasons it persists is because it protects moderate members of both parties from the leaders of their parties. So one of the things that, you know, Joe Manchin will say, well, he's not going to support the removal of the filibuster because, you know, there's this long, you know, this long tradition of it promoting, you know, bipartisan, whatever. That's, you know, not the real reason, and it's probably not even true. I mean, the real reason is that he and Senator Sinema would be forced to vote on a lot of Democratic bills, which are very unpopular. And so reforming the filibuster is almost always going to be an internal party debate among the majority party. It's, you know, the minority party has very little to say about whether it will stay or go. My guess is that when the Republicans take over, because they're more homogeneous than the Democrats, it will go. And then most people will lament that it's gone because it will be, you know, first used by you know, a Republican Senate to override, you know, a Democratic, you know, minority. But I think that, you know, the fact of the matter is it will go when the Republicans take over, and the reason why it doesn't go now is because the Democrats can't reach a consensus on what their agenda is going to be. So I don't have any claims about whether it's better or worse, but, you know, just the facts are that, you know, the senators' interests are going to dominate, you know, this discussion.
I think the broad point here is that political rules are a means to the end of policymaking, and policymaking is a means to the end of people trying to achieve whatever social goals and values they have. And so their views about specific political rules are likely to be structured in substantial part by what the implications are for their pursuit of their own values. And so if no one is right and the Republicans do away with the filibuster, all the people who've been arguing for the past few years that the filibuster is a terrible thing will suddenly be on the side of thinking that it was the preserve of democracy and the Republicans were terrible, evil people to get rid of it.
Right, well, I think we've got to wrap it up there as we've run out of time, but I just would like to really thank our fantastic panelists for your time. It's been a really, really interesting and insightful discussion, and it's been a pleasure hosting you both tonight. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Oh, I'd also like to add to our audience that Anthony has very kindly said that if you would like to direct any questions you have directly to him, then you can send them to us and we will pass them on. So yes, thank you very much.
Bye.